Hey guys, welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we are going to be continuing our reread of the first part of Prophs 3.0, beginning with an Arya chapter. I am hoping to get through like 4 chapters in this episode, and some of these chapters are quite long, so this one might be a little bit lengthy, but let's jump right in. The sun beat down on the grounds of the castle, and there wasn't a cloud in the bright blue sky, but the air had gone absolutely frigid. The windows in the washroom were closed tight, but there was still a chill as Arya was forced out of the bathwater. "We might have snow," her mother muttered in her thick accent, "if there are ever any clouds." "Do I have to wear that dress?" she asked as the servants patted her dry. She'd been scrubbed so hard that even her birthmark looked reddened, and her skin felt raw. The gray velvet thing that Septim Ordain and Mother had picked out looked so tight. "Of course, the king is coming. You have to look your best." She let out a sigh, but she didn't fight them as they slipped the thing on over her small clothes. It felt like it was squeezing her sides. So I'm going to pause right here real quick and note that Cat having an accent is a new thing that came into Prophs 3.0. In each region, they speak a different language in this version. That's not immediately clear due to me changing the names of the characters and places back to the original ones. But each region spoke, it's hard to say their own language because there were supposed to be connections between certain regions that implied history, but it's not super immediately clear if you read about it. The point being that Cat has a very different accent from the other characters because they don't speak natively the same languages. I think this story does a better job of getting that across with the accents and stuff than Prophs 2.0. And that's mostly because in Prophs 2.0 there weren't different languages, but due to the search replace, it made it seem like there were. So you might remember some weird moments where it says the character speaks a perfect lengua de plata, which is a language in Prophs 3.0, but in Prophs 2.0 it referred to an accent. So you had characters saying like this character can speak a perfect this, that, and the other when that character shouldn't be speaking that at all. And it was very, very confusing, but this story does a better job integrating it. Anyway, her hair was brushed until it looked like chocolate, and her boots were made of a supple black leather. She never did like to look this fine. She always managed to make a mess. Her mother wore a stunning gray gown trimmed in black, and her auburn hair tumbled down her shoulders. When they reached the bottom floors, they were wreathed with sumptuous black furs that gleamed in the sunlight. The whole of their house had turned out in front of the castle, from the guard to the servants, all looking their absolute best. Her older brothers had been shaved, and Theon as well, and her father's beard was neatly trimmed. Sansa's hair shined like beaten copper, and her gown was the same shade of shining silver as her eyes. That's just hard to say, wow. "Do you really think the king will ask father to be the hand?" Bran asked her as Mother left to take her place beside their father. "Of course he would. Why else would he come?" she answered back. She knew that the king and her father were old friends. They'd squired together, gone to war together, and won the kingdom together. They'd probably have slain King Aerys together, but Lord Jaime had beaten them to it. Lord Aaron had been their foster as well. It made too much sense. That was actually a little nice bit of world building mentioning, like, they would have slain the king together, but Jaime did it, and, like, anyway, they were shushed as a great sea of people approached them through the gates. There were hundreds of them, a giant wheelhouse among them, riding under rich blue There were hundreds of them, a giant wheelhouse among them, riding under rich blue banners graced by a silver serpent with great antlers atop its head. They bowed when the convoy stopped, and when they stood again, a large man that rode at the very front hopped off his horse and approached father. "Ned, it's been too long," he said jovially. His accent curled some of his words. Father bowed his head. "Your Grace, Winterfell is yours." She was actually shocked. The king was not the man she'd expected, but the crown of silver antlers he wore on his head confirmed. He was fat with a round belly, and his black beard concealed neck rolls, she knew. The king was of impressive height, however, at least half a foot taller than father, and had eyes in a piercing shade of blue, the color of a pale sky. Gonna get out in front of this now and preemptively say, once you finish listening to me read through all of this, go back and listen to the episode of Prophs 2.0 with the Bran chapter that tells this same thing. Note how similar they are, because the more I read this, the more it starts to feel like a search and, or not a search and replace, but like a copy and paste, with a few key details changed. The king looked him up and down. "You've gotten fat," he said disapprovingly. She saw father tense, and then his eyes flicked down to the king's immense gut. The king let out a laugh and pulled him into a crushing hug. The king then moved to Mother and hugged her like he was his own sister. The rest of the party began to dismount after that. Queen Cersei came from the wheelhouse bearing a heavy fur over a dress too thin for this weather. That's a nice bit of character detail that says something about the Southerners in general. A thin tiara of sparkling silver antlers nestled in her thick golden hair, and her eyes were the color of turquoise. The 6 reddish spots of House Lannister trailed under her left eye. Her soft face almost looked too young to be his queen, and too young to have borne the tall boy whose arm she held, or even the other girl and the boy next to them. You know what? I do want to note very quickly that the little note of Cersei seeming too young. So, throughout prophs, Cersei is younger than her book and show counterparts. I'm not entirely sure how old Cersei is in the books, but I think her and Jaime are in their early 30s, while her and Jaime are about 36 in the show in season 1. If I'm remembering correctly, in prophs, depending on which version it is, Cersei ranges between the ages of like 28 and her early 30s. So she is significantly younger than Robert, who is about 40 or like 38, 39 when all this happens. And there was actually a point where she had been aged down so much that I didn't do the math correctly, and I realized that when her and Robert would have gotten married, she would have been 10 or something like that. And I was like, whoa, hold on, wait a minute. It's just interesting that it's noted here how young she looks. Also, this is the first time I think Cersei has been blonde since any version of prophs. I'm surprised. She saw Lord Jaime shake his golden locks from his shining helm. He wore armor the vibrant color of amber, with a cloak of purple embroidered with gold, the colors of his house. He looked more than the knight he had once been, like he could be a king himself. The other brother, Lord David, was helped from his horse by an attendant to a golden cane topped with a lion's head. He walked with a noticeable limp, and one of his eyes was cloudy white. She'd heard he was blind in that eye. In the old versions, this character, David, quote-unquote, is just Tyrion, so I called him Tyrion. Here, however, this is very clearly not Tyrion. Like, even if we ignore the fact that he is apparently blind in one eye, he's never mentioned to have dwarfism in this, so he's definitely a different character. So we're just gonna call him David. It's sort of the same thing with the whole, like, Ava versus Nymeria thing. Another note, why is Jaime's armor amber instead of gold? That seems like, number one, I don't think the color combination of, like... You know what? I take that back. Is amber not just gold colored? I just thought about that. Like, I guess it depends on the tree? I don't know. It's just a weird usage of a word. I don't know why I changed that. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here. What I'm going to assume, and I am really trying to assume the best here, is that I was using amber just as a synonym for gold because I had used the word gold in the previous sentence and didn't want to repeat myself. That's really all I can think of right now, unless up until the very moment that I recorded this, I genuinely thought amber was a different color, but it's whatever. Let's get back to the story. The queen looked at the gray stone walls of the castle in awe and blushed when father kissed her rings. She got a feeling that Lord Jaime was less impressed. Prince Tommen and Princess Marcella were nice, but they seemed so boring. Jesus, you just met them. Prince Joffrey, the tall one, had a smug look about him that she didn't like a bit. He seemed quite taken by Sansa, and she swore she saw Robb, Jon, and Theon straighten when he kissed her hand. Once the formalities were over with, the king turned to their father and said, "Take me to the crypts, Ned. I'd like to pay my respects." The queen straightened, but didn't say a thing as one of the servants ran to fetch them lanterns. She guessed that the king wanted to pay his respects to her Aunt Lyanna. She was his betrothed before she passed after the war. The other servants led the rest of the royal family into the castle. Her family followed behind. She felt someone remove her cloak as soon as she stepped through the doors, and the cold air seeped through her velvet and silks. She was nearly ready to return upstairs when she was taken by an idea. She turned as Bran took off his own cloak and pulled him into the nearest room and shut the door behind them. "What are you doing?" he asked before he had even turned around. "We have to wait for them to clear out," she said, putting her ear to the door. "But why?" He was immediately shushed. "Listen to this," she hissed. He came and pressed his ear to the door as well. I cannot read the line "listen to this" without thinking about Back to the Future now. "Is that any way to speak of my husband, brother?" she heard a woman say. The voice was all flowery and the accent tight. She knew the voice of every attendant in the castle, and none of them sounded like that. It must have been the queen. "The dead would wait, dear sister," a man said back. He had a voice like warm honeyed wine. She guessed it was Lord Jaime. "He's the king. He's the king. If he'd like to go to the crypts as soon as he comes on the grounds, he can," the queen told him. The Lord's voice became lower, and she pressed herself closer to the door. Doesn't it bother you that he still kneels at the feet of his former betrothed when she has been dead for 17 years? An older, rougher voice was the one that answered him. You act as if she would steal him away. She assumed that was Lord David. He should be kneeling to his queen, Lord Jamie said. His voice took an annoyed tone. The voices became so low that she strained to hear through the wood. He is insatiable, Lord David said, but even Robert would not bet a corpse. Are you so sure? Jamie spat back at him. Arya's eyes widened amusedly, but Bran's jaw actually dropped. Really? The queen said, sounding disgusted. You both go too far. The hall seemed to go quiet after that. Did that really happen? Bran asked her. He sounded like he was in shock. Kingslayer, she spat, rolling her eyes. What? Bran said. She ignored him. He's going to be a right pain in the ass, I can feel it. Bran was too dazed to say otherwise. This conversation has been in every single version of prophs so far, and every time I kind of find myself wondering what the point of it is. There is a bit of establishment in it, in the fact that this is the first time we're hearing about exactly how long ago the war ended and stuff like that. But I still find myself wondering, like, why does this information need to be conveyed through this conversation? Why are Arya and Bran the ones that need to overhear it every single time it happens? I'm just not entirely sure what the point of this scene is and why I always felt the need to include it in every single version of this chapter. Now, one thing I can say that might work toward answering that question is the fact that every single version of prophs up until I stopped writing prose for it has been told completely through the POVs of the child characters. So I think Prophs 2.0 had the most POVs. So back then we had Theon, Bran, Arya, and Jon, and that was it, you know? I don't know why Sansa wasn't a POV, but we talked about that when we talked about that. Same thing here. The only POVs we've had so far are Bran, Jon, and Arya. I don't even think Theon has POVs in this one, and neither does Sansa. So when you have the kids as the POV characters, conveying information about stuff like this is a little bit harder, so they have to overhear certain things because they weren't around when this stuff happened. If, like, Ned or Cat, or if Tyrion existed in this, Tyrion had been POV characters, it would be different because they could just think about it. But the kids, on the other hand, have to deliberately hear other people talking about it or something like that. It just seems like this is a really weird way to establish the tension in Cersei and Robert's relationship, as well as the fact that Jaime doesn't like Robert, when we could establish that elsewhere, probably during a feast of some sort, like, whatever. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here, and I actually have to disagree with everything that I've just said. Oh boy. So, while I understand that I find this device for establishing all this stuff confusing, I think the real problem here is not that the device itself is bad, but the fact that it's carried over from a chapter that was from a different character's POV. So if you listened to Prophs 2.0, you might remember that originally this chapter was from Bran's POV. And when you have this in Bran's POV, it actually makes way more sense, because it begins building up the fact that there are some things that are slightly different about Jaime. And Jaime is a major character in Bran's POV for certain tower-related reasons later on. So, establishing his thoughts about Robert and his dynamic with Cersei is actually really, really important in Bran's POV. When you suddenly displace it into Arya's POV, it's literally just like, I don't want to say info dumping, but it's just exposition now. And it feels really off because it's like, well, why is Arya overhearing this? Whereas in the other one, Arya had a different reason for pulling Bran into the room, and she just kind of was there. This was more about what Bran was overhearing and his feelings and stuff like that, you know? So I think that's the actual problem with what's going on here, and not so much the device itself. It just makes more sense where it originally was, which is something that I think you can say about a few things in this version. But anyway, let's get back to it. Arya cracked the door and peeked out. The hall was empty, just as she suspected. The voices echoed down from the stairs that led up to the great keep now. She motioned for Bran to follow her, and slowly she made for the front door. When she made it outside, she took off in a run towards the side of the castle. "You never told me what we're doing," Bran said to her. She shushed him. "Do you want to get caught?" They're in the Great Keep. How can the stairs lead up to the Great Keep? They're literally inside the cap. Or unless in this version, Winterfell is one entire building that's mostly connected. But still, whatever. She didn't stop until she came upon a pair of massive wooden doors that went light around their edges through age. They looked solid and heavy, but they'd been propped open by an old metal pail filled with sand. "This is where you wanted to go?" Bran asked, staring up at them. "Haven't you always wanted to see the crypts?" she said with a sly smile. "What?" he said to her, but she was already slipping into the darkness. The air was even colder in here and hung thin and dry. She used the light from the door to see her way down the steps, hewn from the stone the castle was built on. She was actually glad for the fine boots now. They made her quiet as a cat. At the bottom, they stepped into a long tunnel of stone and soil and dark, splintering wood. There were large slabs of wood set into the walls, white and stained with gray, with their sigil carved into each one, blacker than the shadows surrounding them, with eyes red as fire. When she pressed herself up against the wall, the wood was cold under her hands. The dirt swallowed any sound that was made, so she kept on until she could hear her father and the king more clearly. She only stopped once she reached a large wooden beam. "Lord Eddard Stark," she heard the king say, "I would name you Hand of the King." "I told you," she mouthed back towards Bran, who had gone agape again. When she peeked past the wood, all she could see were silhouettes in the flickering light of the lantern. Her father was down on his knee. "I'm not worthy of the title," father said to him. "Please," the king scoffed. "After 18 years, you still speak to me of honor? Who else would I choose to rule this kingdom while I drink and eat myself to death?" He let out a laugh. "My banner bears a serpent, but never have I felt so surrounded by vipers. I need some voice of reason before they swallow me whole. You helped me win the dragon's mouth, now help me hold it." "The South is no place for a northerner," her father argued. "Did you tell your father that before he sent you to the Eyrie? Off your knees, you," the king commanded. "If Lyanna were still here, you'd be bound by blood. As it seems, you have a daughter and I a son. We'll join our houses. Sansa is only 13, your grace. Uzakt. Jesus. You act as if I asked for Arya," the king chuckled. "It's not too soon for the betrothal. They can wed when Joffrey comes of age. Your honor do you that, Ned?" "Of course, your grace." Father swung the lantern as he gestured for the king to go ahead of him. "Can I have time for consideration, though? I must inform my wife and the children." "Of course. Just don't keep me waiting." Okay, I'm going to pause here very quickly because we're almost at the end of the chapter. Just to note that every time we read the story, it feels like there is a different thing going on in the crypts. I think in the last version, the slabs of wood or whatever was there. But in the books and in the show, the graves of members of the Stark family are covered with statues, and then each statue has like a direwolf and a sword. And this is meant to keep the ghosts of the things in the, whatever. But in this story, depending on which version you're reading, sometimes there's statues, sometimes there's this thing where there's, apparently the bodies are buried standing up. That's so weird. But they're in the crypts and they're covered with a piece of weirwood, I guess, or ink tree in this one, carved with an image of a direwolf, and that keeps them in their graves, which is the same sort of concept. It begs the question of why I changed it. Like, this is a thing that's common throughout prophs. There are many, many changes in these stories, especially in some of these, like, middle-ish versions, that make you question, like, why? Like, there are some things that I kind of understand that even though I don't know the genesis of them, I think they're interesting enough to keep in. Like, the major societal changes, which we won't really be able to talk about until Prophs 3.0 Part 2. But, like, the big shifts in the way that, like, Northern society works, those are interesting. I don't remember exactly why I did it, but they're interesting enough that I'm like, okay, let's explore this. But little details, like the fact that the crypts of the First Men are apparently walled up with wood carved with direwolves instead of buried in the ground and covered with statues that also have direwolves. It's like, that seems like such a minuscule change, and it's like, well, why? But anyway. The two men went quiet as they moved back down the corridor, the lantern becoming brighter as they neared. Arya grabbed Bran and pulled him to the ground with her, crouching best they could in the darkness. You know what? See, this part wouldn't have to go this way if they had statues. The silence amongst them grew heavy as the shadows danced on the walls. She was suddenly stricken with a shiver. Standing amongst the tombs of the kings of old, she couldn't help but think of ghosts. Damn this infernal place, the king said, breaking the silence. It's no place for her. Would that I could have buried her in the godswood, your grace, under the heart where the sun would reach, but she asks to be here. My honor did me that. I'd curse your honor, but I need it now. Her father stopped a moment as the king went ahead of him. Why do you keep such places, Ned? He asked back. Arya flitted to the other side of the beam where they hid. When her father looked back, he saw nothing there. A dark, cold place full of ghosts, the king said. There are no ghosts here, your grace, her father explained as he returned to his side. The direwolves keep the old lords in their tombs. No man would cross them. The king nodded. Let us hope the same is true in life. And that is the end of that chapter. God, this chapter was long. I mean, every version of this chapter is long because its source chapter is kind of lengthy, but still. I felt it in this one. I really just wanted to get to the end of it because my main issue with this chapter is that it is just the same chapter from Prophs 2.0, but rewritten slightly to integrate the changes in Prophs 3.0 better. So it basically just feels like a minor rewrite to integrate the search and replace things from the Prophs 2.0 chapter, and that's it. I don't feel like this really brought anything new to the table. Like, even the first chapter, for as much as I really didn't enjoy that, even though it wasn't terrible, at least it tried to do something different with the wolf incident, you know? Even if it didn't make sense, it tried. This chapter is literally the same exact chapter. Hey guys! Editing Frankie here. So, I know you just listened to like 2 or 3 minutes of me claiming that this chapter is exactly the same as the chapter from Prophs 2.0, but it's not. Even outside of the stuff that I changed because it's Arya, I completely forgot, and I cannot believe that I did not realize this, that the bit in the crypts with these two characters overhearing Ned and Robert does not happen in Prophs 2.0 at all. After the bit in the hall where they're overhearing the queen and Jaime and Tyrion talking about the king, Arya and Bran and their wolves, they go to the godswood and do some shit with the necklace. This stuff in the crypts is all new for this version, and somehow I completely forgot about that. I think I'm just so used to this version of the chapter because this is in both this version of this and then the edited version that we're going to read next episode that I just completely forgot that it's not in Prophs 2.0 at all. And I'm sorry that I didn't mention that at the time, Jesus Christ. But yeah, so this chapter does actually do something new. The problem is that that something new has nothing to do with Arya. One thing I will say that it does have over chapter 2 is that at least it wasn't me doing something new that got hijacked by the original chapter that it was quote-unquote adapting. So it does have that going for it. Furthermore, it also has that same problem that chapter 2 has where I don't really understand why this is from Arya's POV specifically. There was nothing in this chapter that makes me feel like I needed to see this through Arya's eyes. And I think that is best exemplified by the fact that this was originally a Bran chapter and I didn't have to do that much rewriting to change who the POV was. Clearly, this chapter was not about either of them. This chapter was actually about Ned. Hey guys, editing Frankie here. This chapter is not about Ned. I don't know how I came to that conclusion at all, outside of the fact that the original chapter that this is based on from A Game of Thrones is about Ned. But Ned as a character doesn't even feature that heavily until this last bit in the crypts, which, to be completely fair, is a completely new addition that doesn't really pertain to the character that this chapter is supposed to be about anyway. And like, sure, that part pertains to him, but this is not about Ned. This entire chapter has focused on Arya's feelings, you know, her feelings about everything that's going on, her judgments of the royal family, not Ned, until this very end part. So, I mean, the chapter is supposed to be about Arya, but because there are weird things that happen where you can't really figure out Arya's motivations, that does muddy the waters, but it is still supposed to be about her. It just doesn't do a good job of showing that because, like I said, it was originally a Bran chapter and it still has elements that only make sense in Bran's original chapter. But anyway, let's get back to the criticism. So it makes me question, like, well, why cut Ned as a POV? Like, In general, and this is a general critique of prophs as a whole, I don't really know why I clung to this idea of only having the children be the POV characters when there are multiple instances of like situations throughout the story that should be told through the POVs of adults. This was something that we saw really clearly in Prophs 2.0, where the story, number one, the pacing of the story was really messed up by cutting out a bunch of the POV characters, but constantly these new things would pop up and the characters would have to sort of exposition dump them on us because as kids they weren't privy to the original like arrangement, and it also meant that information was withheld from us for certain reasons because the kids just weren't there. I just don't think that was really the best idea. I shouldn't have done that. But anyway, for this chapter in particular, it's I don't have any strong feelings about it. It's not the best chapter in the world, but it's not terrible. One thing I will say is that there are some nice bits with the use of the imagery on the sigils. So while I do still question why I changed the sigil of House Baratheon, Robert talking about how his banners have a serpent on them, but he feels like he's surrounded by vipers, that was a nice line. I really like that. And that same thing, the last line where Ned is like, the direwolves keep them in their tombs, and he's like, let's hope the same is true in life. I really like that too. That one, of course, doesn't rely on a change in the sigils, but I don't think that line is in the original book. But either way, so those little moments were nice, but outside of that, I'm kind of like, eh. So anyway, now that we're done trudging through that, let's move on to the next chapter, which is back to Bran. Bran felt as if he was squeezed between two mattresses. The padding they'd strapped to him made it hard for him to move, and even harder to swing the wooden practice sword. When he couldn't block the hits that Prince Tommen sent his way, he didn't even feel them. He tried his best nonetheless. The prince wobbled toward him, gripping his sword with both hands, and Bran parried it and pushed him back. The prince went tumbling to the ground and rolled like a turtle stuck on its shell. He heard Theon let out a laugh behind him. "Ah, I think that'll be all," Lord Roger Cassell said to them. "A good fight, lads, that much is true," he said with a chuckle. "Careful how you hold that, my lord. His grace could have had you on your back just as easy. Help these two out of their armor," he told the attendants. A serving girl with blood-red hair took him to the side and started to untie his padding. "You did very well, my lord," she said as she slipped the cushions from round his arms. He let out a sigh of relief as he moved them around. Fully this time. "Thank you, Roz," he said back politely. She started on the ones around his midsection, but they were both distracted by the talk back in the yard. So this is a common thing in a few later versions of Prophs. We're not going to be able to go through them all because some of them are just summaries for a television show. But for a time, Roz does a turn as a servant within the castle rather than being a sex worker from the Winter Town. There are some other versions where she does have that old job restored and it kind of switches back and forth. But in this version, we see clearly she is a servant. "Your Grace, will you go another round?" Lord Roderick asked Joffrey, who'd been sitting off on the other side with Lord Jaime. Okay, so here's a problem. I know in the north they don't have a lot of knights, but it was very specifically noted that Roger Cassell was a knight. I don't understand why he's not just a knight here. Also, the fact that he's constantly referred to as Lord Roderick rather than Roderick, it makes some of the dialogue, like, hard to read, but we'll get to that when we get to that. He shrugged as he got to his feet. "Maybe, but I grow tired of using those tourney swords. I've been itching to break this in," he said as he pulled a sword from his belt. Bran couldn't help but gasp when he saw it. The hilt was all wrought in shining gold and encrusted in rubies. His brothers hadn't been allowed to carry swords when they were his age. Lord Roderick tensed. "Well, your grace." "Stark, you carry a real sword, don't you?" "Of course," Robb answered matter-of-factly, but that would hardly be appropriate. "And why?" "I've got 4 years on you." "He might surprise you," Lord Jaime said. "Surely an arrangement can be made." My lord." See, this is what I'm talking about. "My lord," Lord Roderick started, "I am far from permitted to allow a 14-year-old to use live steel, even the crowned prince, and you're no more permitted to deny the prince," Lord Jaime added, narrowing his turquoise eyes. "I answer to my liege lord, my lord." And Lord Stark... Sorry, Jesus. "And Lord Stark would not permit such things. And who does your liege lord answer to but his father?" "Oh, blast it all," the prince finally said. "Bring me the cursed tourney sword, then. At the very least, let me spar with Stark." He smirked. "I need the practice." "Well, all done then," Roz said suddenly. When Bran looked down, he was finally free again. The sweat on his skin chilled as soon as it was hit with the frigid air. "I reckon you're done for the day. Do you want me to get your wolf?" "No, I'll get him myself, thank you." He left her and moved for the cloakroom. The air was warmer inside, but not by much, due to the large window in the wall. The tiny flames of the candles on the walls flickered weakly. His pup let out a yip when he approached it. It felt like he had grown so much in the 2 weeks since they found him. When he picked his pup up to warm himself, he actually had some weight in his arms now. He decided to make his way upstairs and see if Arya was done with her lessons yet. Even though Mother had put her on punishment, he was still allowed to see her. To his surprise, she wasn't in her room. He hadn't even reached it when he saw her and Ava in the upstairs hall, kneeling at a window that overlooked the yard he was just in. John was there with Ghost, too, sat on the sill with a thin cloak pulled around himself, gnawing at the stone on the end of the slim silver chain he wore around his neck. This is kind of weird. Why is there no chapter covering the opening feast? We learn that Arya is on punishment, but we don't know why. Now, I know that in Prophs 2.0, we did have an issue, number one, with the time discrepancy of there seemingly being 2 opening feasts, because Theon's chapter showed us one, but Arya's chapter, which came before that, told us about another one, and she had been put on punishment. So I can see that I think I wanted to skip the repetition and just, blow right by that. But it's still weird that the opening feast doesn't have, if we wanted to find a moment to portray all of these uneasy feelings in the royal family, the royal feast would have been a good place. I don't understand why we couldn't just give that Theon chapter back to the story and then keep rolling from there, But whatever. What are you doing here? Bran asked her. Arya let out a squeal and fell backwards onto her bum. What are you doing here? She asked him back. Ava gave an excited yip, and Bran let his pup onto the ground. He felt his skin go to goose flesh under his cottons. Lord Roderick says I'm done for the day, he said as he sat next to her. She's hiding from your mother, John told him. His voice sounded a shade tired. She ran out on her stitching. Arya narrowed her eyes. I couldn't stand to hear Sansa talk about the prince anymore. I've been here since you knocked over Prince Tommen. Did you see that? Bran started. Joffrey asked for live steel, she finished with a roll of her eyes. He's very presumptuous. I bet he can't even wield a real sword correctly. Robb won, by the way. Of course he did, John scoffed. Who does he think he is, taking on an 18-year-old? Okay, I'm sorry. Maybe it's because I'm 27 reading this. But there is something so funny about these characters being like, oh, what does he think he is, taking on an 18-year-old? Because I'm sitting here 18's not that old, but I keep forgetting that Joffrey is 14 and Jon is 18. So to him, that's probably a 1,000,000-year difference. But to me, it's just you're both children. Jeez. Anyway, that'd be like you taking on Father, Arya said to him. It'd be like you taking on Father, he corrected. Robb's a damn fury with that sword, and he's worse with that dagger. That's true, Bran agreed. Robb had gotten the knife on his last name day. It was a fine thing, with a blade made of milky white dragon glass, set on a silver hilt carved with the image of the ink tree. But you're better, he finished. John laughed. Please. Why weren't you in the yard, he asked. John's expression went a little dark. Lord Jaime said that only true-born swords may touch the prince, he told him. Arya pursed her lips and then said, how come a man called the Kingslayer gets to decide who can and can't hurt the royalty? John smiled again and shook his head. That might be the best line I wrote throughout of all of this. What does that mean? Okay, so now we're going to run into an issue with the fact that I'm changing and translating things. So, when the Targaryens came west in this version, they did not speak English. They spoke Valyrian still, and they kind of spread it into Westeros. So, in the area around King's Landing, even to this day, in this version, there are places that are named in Valyrian, which in this story is, I think, Sindarin from Lord of the Rings. So there are multiple places, especially around King's Landing, like I said, including King's Landing itself, that are named in Elvish or Valyrian. So in this story, the word Kingslayer is not in English, it's in Valyrian. And that's due to the fact that some people in King's Landing do speak Valyrian, colloquially, which is a little bit weird, but it made sense in this story, I guess. But anyway, just to explain why this part is coming up, and Bran is like, what's Kingslayer mean? What does that mean? He finally asked her. Really? Arya asked exasperatedly. Bran sighed. It means Kingslayer in the dragon tongue, Jon told him, but you're not supposed to call him that, he added, looking pointedly at Arya. She rolled her eyes again. But that was a good thing, wasn't it? Lord Jaime was a member of the Kingsguard, Bran, Arya said. He was supposed to protect the king, even if he was a crazy old badger. They say he threw off the cloak, though, Jon said. Well, he said he threw off the cloak. That's why he's not a knight anymore. But you can't just renounce your vows by throwing off the cloak, Bran said. After a moment, he backtracked. Can you? Jon shrugged. I don't know, but that's what they say happened. But do you believe that? Arya asked. Jon stared out of the window a moment and then answered, I don't know. And that's the end of that chapter. This is weird. Okay, so this chapter wasn't terrible. What I will say is that this is refreshing. It's something new. I have not seen this before. And if there's one thing I am tired of with prophs, it is reading the same 5 chapters over and over again. So this chapter at least is kind of like a palate cleanser, and I do appreciate that. However, what is the point? I don't get it. And I think this bothers me a lot because this is based off of a chapter that does exist in the books. This is Arya's first chapter in the books. And the whole point of the chapter is establishing both Arya and her relationship with Jon. So the chapter actually does things that do that. Like when Jon and Arya talk about how Joffrey's personal shield and the personal shield of the king has the Lannister lion and the Baratheon sigil combatant. And Jon is like, wow, it's so weird that the queen's sigil gets the same amount of weight as the king's. And she's like, the woman matters. So that tells you something about Arya as a character and on through the rest of the chapter. But here, with Bran being the POV, it starts to make you wonder, like, okay, so why is Bran the POV? What is the significance of this character scene? It's the same problem that we had with the last chapter. I don't get why Bran is the one I needed to see this through instead of like Arya or Jon. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here yet again. But I understand kind of why I was confused about what the quote-unquote point of this chapter was, but the way I talked about it really made it feel like this chapter was filler, and it wasn't at all. Which, after this, when we cut back into the criticisms, I do talk about a lot of the stuff that was established here. But the reason why this chapter is from Bran's POV specifically is because of the actual contents. For example, the fact that this is like at sword practice, and I know that Arya's chapter, the one that this was based off of in the original books, was also at that sword practice. But here, there's a reason why I chose Bran specifically and not Jon in particular. Because the stuff that Bran sees is actually relevant to his plotline down the line. Like I am about to say, Jaime kind of has his establishing moment here, and that entire argument is really important for understanding Jaime as a character. And as I said before in another insert, Jaime is super important to Bran's plotline. As well, we also establish Joffrey and we learn more about Jon. There's all kinds of good stuff here. The other thing too is that in the clip that I cut, I claimed that the chapter quote unquote got off track when it started talking about like Robb and Jaime, and that's not true at all. There's a clear through line that connects all of these things together. If not through the entirety of the conversation, you can clearly see how they get from one topic to the other. Talking about the fact that Joffrey wanted to fight with live steel against Robb is how they end up talking about Robb. Jon commenting on Robb is important because it sets up some things that were supposed to happen with Jon later. And then after that, Arya's comment about Jaime is how they start talking about Jaime and the cloak thing, which again establishes his character for things that are supposed to happen later. It's just setting up a lot of distrust about him. So that's important. Where this chapter falls apart, and the thing that kind of puts a big damper on it, is the ending. And I mean the very, very end. The fact that it ends with Arya asking Jon his opinion on things, and that's the final note, that is really, really weird. And it kind of like confuses everything because this chapter is about Bran. We should be finishing on his thoughts and his opinions. It's not about Jon. So having this distinct moment where Arya's like, but what do you think, Jon? Doesn't really make sense because it's not his chapter. And oddly enough, for as much as I clearly am not enjoying this while reading this, re-listening, I think that this chapter is really not that bad. That one end part, though, really, really throws things off, which oddly enough is the thought that I had about the last chapter too while re-listening to it. everything was fine, and the chapter was actually clearly about Arya up until the part where they go down into the crypts, because once you get down there, it's like, well, wait, what is going on? Why is this happening? Why does she care? You know? Here, it's like, why are we getting John's opinion? It's the same thing. So I understand my confusion at the time, especially because I was trying to just like get through this and finish all this. But I think it is very clear why this chapter exists and why it's from Bran's POV. This chapter tells us a lot of information and tells us a lot about different characters. Like, I think Jaime's establishing character moment happens here, and I think it's actually a pretty good one. His argument with, like, Lord Roderick over something as stupid as whether a 14-year-old should be able to take on a grown-ass man. And, like, I did talk about, like, oh, he's 18, but still, like, Robb is, in this society, grown, and Joffrey's not yet. So Jaime getting into an argument with the master of arms at the castle that his family is staying at as a guest because he wants to listen to his liege lord and not allow someone under a certain age to use live steel because that's not what he's supposed to do. It says a lot about Jaime as a character, you know? Especially because Joffrey is not the person arguing in this. At the end, Joffrey is the one who kind of breaks it up and is just like, whatever, I'll just use the sword. So it also works to establish him as a character. And then when they do talk about it, we do learn a little bit about Robb too, and about Jon. So I'm okay with that stuff. And that's good establishment. I like that. But what is this chapter about? It's just, geez. This version of the story is kind of all over the place. But anyway, let's move on to, oh god, yeah, this episode's going to be a little bit long, to the next chapter, which is Arya again. There was no way she thought she could get into more trouble, but she managed to. You know what would be fun? If we ever saw Arya actually get in trouble. She couldn't help it. She had been feeling restless. Her parents, however, had had enough. They locked her and her pup into her room between her lessons and meals, and she could have no visitors, not even Bran. But more than that, she wasn't allowed out of the castle until they left for King's Landing. She could have died when they told her that. Again, after I read this, go back to the episode of Prophs 2.0 where I read the equivalent of this chapter from that. Compare and contrast. She sat on the edge of her bed, swinging her legs over the side, watching her skirts move back and forth. It had been a week now. Her punishment was almost over, and they were due south tomorrow. Soon she would be free to ride and do whatever else she might please, but for now she was stuck. She didn't even know if she would be allowed to the departure feast that night. She was not sure she wanted to go anyway. She didn't seem to have fun unless she was making a mess of things, and while her brother and Prince Tommen did enjoy it, her mother and her sister did not. The queen would not be pleased, but that would be too bad. Oh, here we go. She thought the queen was a queer woman. She was not like her brothers, all sharp and witty like Lord David or stuck up like the Kingslayer. She was sweet and nice, almost too much so. She had been upset when Jon had not attended the last 2 feasts, even though he was a bastard. There was a rumor that she never even wore the colors of her House Lannister. Arya had grown to believe that. She had seen the woman in a rainbow of rich fabrics during their visit, but never the purple and gold. Huh. Okay, so that's interesting. This is not really like a comment on the story itself, but in the GOT rewrite, Cersei also does not usually wear the colors of her house. That's just a weird little detail that I don't think I actually did it on purpose to copy off of this, but it's funny that I came up with that same idea twice, and it also means something different because in the GOT rewrite, Cersei doesn't want to give the impression that her alliances align more with her family than they do with her husband. She also wants to really, like, make people underestimate her, so she tends to wear a very specific palette of colors, rather than just, like, every color but red and gold at the same time, so she wears a lot of, like, pastels. This version, on the other hand, I don't remember exactly why she doesn't wear the Lannister colors, but there was a specific reason. I think it was supposed to be, like, symbolic of her feeling separated from the rest of her family for some reason. But that was just an interesting little detail that carried over that I'm surprised was there. She hopped off her bed and sat upon the carpet on her floor, and Ava followed. The pups were getting so big. She couldn't even pick hers up anymore, and her head came to Arya's thigh. It felt strange to even call her a pup anymore. She was almost the size of a full-grown dog, and to think she would get bigger still. She had grown antsier as the week went on. At first she had slept away the hours she was not in her lessons. Ava did not like that. But now she could not stop moving. Oh, God, stop dropping the contractions, please. She rose from her spot on the floor and sat on her bed again. Ava followed. The men had set off for the hunt that morning, and she had watched them go from the window. Since it was the last day, they took a larger party than usual. Rob and the prince and Theon Greyjoy and even Lord David had gone. Why does she refer to Theon by his whole name? He has lived in her house for 18 years. She had wished she could go. The morning had the makings of a good day, but the idea of the hunt itself did not appeal to her. She just wanted to ride. Bran had not gone either, and Jon was too sick to go even if he was permitted. He'd been taken by a fever the day after she was punished again, and it had not loosened its grip since. She never saw him out of his room while the sun was up. Well, she barely saw him at all. And the last time she'd seen him, he looked absolutely tragic. Oh my god. Absolutely tragic. She hoped he would be well enough to see them off tomorrow. She would miss him the most when they were gone. That's interesting, because at no point has Arya's relationship with Jon been established in this. It would have been nice if maybe last chapter we had done that. She wondered what Bran was doing. He was probably off somewhere climbing the castle walls. Her mother told her that the one good thing about her penchant for the myths and histories was that her stories kept Bran off the roofs. He scrambled up the stones faster than a cat climbing the upholstery, and he was more graceful too. He told her the view from the towers was even better than the view from her room, and she was high in the tower. She moved to the window now and opened it up to let the air in. A chill ran through her almost instantly. She could see all the way to the front gate and the roofs of the shorter buildings and the stables and kennels. Farther off she could see the tops of the towers, the ones that lined the castle walls, and the old abandoned ones in the corners crumbling from age. She could even see the longest branches of the heart as they stretched out over the gate of Godswood. How could you get a better view than this? How small is their Godswood? I know, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, in this story, the heart tree is really, really big. Like, really, really big. So I guess it's not that weird. But that's really big. Like, that's a whole woods. A whole woods. But anyway. A breeze let the freezing air flood the room and carried on it the far-off sound of cawing. Bran must have been feeding them being the crows. He went to the tops of the old towers and fed corn to the crows that roosted among the broken rafters. Why did I write that like that? When she saw a cloud of them burst from the roof, however, she wasn't sure. Why would he scare them away? She blinked and there was a shadow on the top of one of them running towards the wall. What was he doing? No wonder Mother was always worried about him. It was at least 100 feet down. And that's the end of that chapter. So, I don't really have any distinct feelings. One thing I will say in this story's, not defense, but on its behalf, is that it was a good idea to take the 2 Arya chapters from Prophs 2.0 and just make them one chapter. That's actually something I suggested in the other story, and I'm glad I kind of did that here. Because clearly there was nothing in the first Arya chapter that couldn't have been told in the second, and vice versa. With the exception of that one moment where Bran was like, "What is this animal?" which was cut out completely. Outside of that, though, I have no strong feelings about this chapter. There's nothing really important here. It's mostly just Arya thinking about a bunch of shit that we should have seen on screen and didn't. So anyway, let's move on to the last chapter. This is Bran. Also, this chapter is not complete. The wind whipped through his hair, the air hitting his face like freezing knives. Normally, he would find this exhilarating. He loved to climb up the towers and jump across the bricks. When he stood on the roofs and looked out over the castle grounds, he felt like he was on top of the world. Now, though, he was running across the top of the wall with reckless abandon, not caring that one misstep could send him hurtling to the ground. He couldn't bring himself to care anymore. He'd almost gone that way even before he started running. That's an interesting opener. The blood that dribbled down his chin was drying on his shirt, and his tongue still pained him. He could still taste the coppery tang in his mouth. His arm hurt, too. Lord Jaime was holding on to it so hard there was no way it hadn't bruised. He'd scraped the skin on his knuckles across the stone bricks as he hung from those vines, and those cuts burned in the cold. Even if he did make it back to the Great Keep, there was no way no one would notice, and that was the opposite of what he wanted. He stopped short when he reached the perimeter walls as a howl ripped through the air. The roofs of the winter town spread out below him. The wall was tall, but if he got down there, he would be home free. No, he couldn't do that. There was nowhere for him to go out there. He couldn't hide in the town. Everyone knew who he was, and he didn't know how to live outside of a castle. But he couldn't go back. Only God knew what would happen to him back there. He spun around, looking desperately for somewhere to go. He started to panic when he heard the sounds of yelling, but when he saw the twisting branches of the heart, he knew what he could do. But he couldn't go by the walls. It would take too long. He'd have to climb down. Vertigo hit him for the first time ever when he looked to the brown grass in the yard. He took his time going down, placing his hands gingerly on the bricks that stuck out far enough. He never liked to climb these walls. The handholds were so thin, not like on the old towers. The thought of it sent a pang through his stomach, and he had to stop. After a moment, he forced himself to start again. A howl ripped through the air just as his feet hit the ground. His pup! He was still sitting at the foot of the tower when he started climbing, and he didn't have time to look after him once he left. Another howl sailed through the air, and he started to get dizzy. He tried to take a step forward, but the ground felt like it was shifting underneath his feet. He needed to get to the godswood and his pup. But his legs stopped working, and he dropped to the ground. All of the colors started to run together, and he began to shiver in the cold. It was so cold. They'd said it'd been a day when he opened his eyes again. Oh, so that was actually kind of neat. Huh. So far, this chapter is much more interesting than anything else we've read. His mother began to cry, and Maester Lewin let out a sigh of relief. He was in the sick room in the great keep now, in a bed covered in thick furs. The walls were draped with heavy tapestries that were supposed to keep the cold out, but he still shivered. Mother pulled the blankets to his neck, and they brought him food, thick soups and warm bread. He took it all in silence, and he didn't feel like he could make his voice come anyway. The visitors passed through as the day went on. Father came multiple times, one time with the king. Arya stayed for a few hours until Mother made her go to her lessons. Lord David came with the queen, who looked pale and sleep-deprived. She kissed him gently on his forehead before she left, and he squeezed his eyes closed. Sansa came too, and Roz brought him dinner, but Lord Jaime came then, and the prince with him. His appetite was lost, and he almost started to shake again, but he forced himself to eat. When Robb and Theon came later, he spoke for the first time that day. "Bring me my wolf, please." On the third day, they began to ask questions. He clutched his wolf close as Maester Lewin asked him all manner of things. "I was only climbing," he said repeatedly. "I just fell is all." He didn't know if they believed him, but he almost didn't care. Would that he could tell the truth, but he would not risk his life again. That night, Father came and told Mother that he was to stay behind when he went south, and it felt like a weight was lifted off of Bran's shoulders. All of his dreams of knighthood were forgotten then. They could wait, he thought later. This is more important. The fourth day, the king's party had to leave. They all came to the room to say their goodbyes, as his legs still felt weak. Mother left him for the first time, and he felt a pang of distress. They were all going south now, and only God knew when they would be back. Okay, that's a weird thing to say, so let's pause here real quick. I don't think this is really a case of the moss troll problem, but more so the reverse moss troll problem. If you remember way back in the Hunger Games reread, the first one, I mentioned how I did not understand why I decided to remove the word eyeliner from the vocabulary of the characters, but then Katniss very randomly says, "Is this what heaven feels like?" And I was like, well, why is that there? This is a similar thing to that. In A Song of Ice and Fire, neither of the religions that are practiced by people who live in Winterfell have singular gods. So it's really weird for Bran to say, well, only God knew what would, because technically the seven are actually one god with seven faces, but most people recognize them as multiple gods, and they are referred to commonly as the new gods. In this version, I actually can't remember what religion the Southerners practice. Now that I'm thinking about it, for a while, the Southerners actually were monotheistic, so maybe that's why he said that. But if that's not what it is and they still worship the seven like they did in Prophs 2.0 or the old gods, that's a little bit like, why is that there? It's a small thing, I guess. So anyway, they wouldn't have the walls of Winterfell to keep them safe. They couldn't go, but they had to. He remembered Father telling Mother before he woke, just vaguely. Father could not deny the king. When Mother returned, it was with old Nan, that ancient nurse that Arya learned all her stories from, instead of Roz. Of course she wasn't there, though. She was going south with the rest of them. They weren't truly gone yet, and the castle already felt empty. He didn't know what Arya saw in that woman. She was shrunken and stooped over a knobby wooden cane, her face all bound up in wrinkles around the eyes. If she had hair, he couldn't see it underneath her scarf. Her eyes were so light that they looked like they were almost white, and he wondered if she could even see. One thing I will never understand in this story, that I think I talked about this before, is why there is a correlation between a character's eye color and whether they can see or not. That's really weird, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Arya had told him that she was the oldest person in the castle, come with one of the 19 Brans before he and his uncle, his great-uncle, his great-great-uncle, no one was quite sure anymore. How had she even come up all those stairs? "Do you need anything?" Mother asked. He shook his head against his wolf. "Are you sure, dear? You've scarcely eaten." He shook his head again and laid it on his wolf. "I haven't named him yet," he said as he felt the pup move up and down in time with his breaths. There's a lot of typos in that sentence. Mother raised her eyebrows and pursed her lips. "Well, darling, I'm sure you'll think of something." "It's been a month." "Ah, my little lord, these things take time," Nan said to him with a toothless smile. And that is the end of that chapter. So, that was fine. Like I said, miles more interesting than anything else we read. What's interesting about this chapter is that it is a rewrite of another chapter, but it's not anything from Prophs 2.0. Instead, it is a rewrite of a Theon chapter that was sort of like a quote-unquote standalone that I wrote to jumpstart Prophs 3.0. I didn't read that because, like I said, it's not connected to this version in particular. Anyway, so this wasn't bad. And one thing I will say is that this chapter is an actual rewrite. It is not simply like I changed the POV. Like, I had to rewrite large portions of the chapter to make up for the change in POV. And I like that I actually put in the work in this one. Furthermore, this being from Bran's POV makes sense because it's all about something that happened to Bran rather than being a chapter that's clearly meant to be about another person told from a different person's POV purely for the sake of trying not to plagiarize the book. So yeah, this chapter wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. It wasn't the best thing in the world. Not my favorite, but none of the chapters in this are my favorite. So overall, this version of Prophs is rough. And I think that's really sad because Prophs 2.0 got weirdly compelling toward the end, especially Jon's chapters. But, like, in general, the story itself actually started to get good. This is not good. This feels like just me trying to rewrite Prophs 2.0 with the new names and locations and stuff, but not actually doing the work to update it at all. And I guess that's valid, but because of that, it just doesn't come off as very, very good. It just feels like a retread of what we've seen before. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here, just with one more insert to reinforce some things that I have said before. So number one, my assertion that this last chapter is better because it's an actual rewrite rather than a chapter from the previous version told from someone else's POV to avoid plagiarization. I don't think that's super fair. It is true that this chapter is better than the others because I actually did the work to rewrite it. However, to say that the previous chapters are just chapters about other people from different people's POVs is not true. And I talked about this in other inserts, so I won't get into a lot of detail. But in particular, chapter 3, Arya's first chapter, starts out being about Arya, but it goes off track at the very end because we are given no indication of Arya's motivations for going to the crypts. Bran's second chapter is clearly about Bran, but it ends on a weird note because it's someone asking Jon his opinion when the chapter isn't about him. And the first chapter has a similar problem where it's clearly about Bran in the beginning, but after a while, Bran starts to feel like a spectator to different events because he never sits back and thinks about things in relation to himself for very long. It's not that the other chapters are clearly about other characters. It's that they just go off on very like strange tangents, which does lead to the second point where I said that this feels like just a rewrite of Prophs 2.0 without any changes. That's clearly not true because there are multiple new things added. And I'm not just talking about like Bran's second chapter, which is a whole brand new chapter. I mean, there are inserts in like chapter 2, which was a Jon chapter originally as well, that are clearly different and not just there to change it so that it makes sense that it's taking place in the Godswood. All of the stuff up until just after Arya shows up in that chapter is completely brand new. You know, Bran's chapter is the only one I think that's kind of rewritten to accommodate the fact that it happens differently. But, you know, then Bran's second chapter is completely brand new. Arya's chapter is a melding of two other chapters, and that's fine. But then Bran's chapter after that, also completely brand new. So there's clearly changes being made, but I think that that actually raises a different question, which is, why was I so hell-bent on sliding in these clearly unedited copy and pasted parts of Prophs 2.0 instead of rewriting them to actually fit in with what I was trying to do here? The best example of this is chapter 2. where the pup naming chapter, John's original intro chapter from Prophs 2.0, just shows up at the end and completely throws off what was going on before. Because as much as I said, oh, that wasn't interesting, everything leading up to that was at least a little bit intriguing and made sense. And then they start naming the wolves and stuff, and you're like, why are we taking this detour and why is it taking so damn long? And the last comment that I have to make actually references an insert that I made in a whole different reread, but I kind of object to the comparison between Prophs 2.0 because, yes, while I was definitely compelled by Prophs 2.0 while I was rereading it for this, in retrospect, Prophs 2.0 is not nearly as good as I thought it was. Like, I recognize that as I was saying that. Prophs 2.0 isn't good, but I found it compelling. However, as I said in the last episode of the Prophs 2.0 reread, the reason why I think the Prophs 2.0 reread was so compelling to me after a while is because I was doing another reread at the same time that I was not really enjoying at all. So going to Prophs, which was better than that at the very least, I was like, wow, this is so much better. But if I had done that by itself, I feel like I would feel kind of differently. And I do remember while editing those episodes, I was just like, this is fine. And while I would say that Prophs 2.0 definitely had its moments, it is hard to compare it quality-wise to this story because this was written an entire year later and it has a completely different set of problems, I feel like. So yeah, I just wanted to jump in one last time to add a few more things. So yeah, I had a comment. Oh yeah, the correlation, very quickly, the correlation between eye color and visual acuity, I'm not sure what to call it. But Old Nan is not the first character whose eye color is used as a sort of like signal to the fact that she can't see. And I don't mean this in the same way that like Lord David has an eye that's like milky white and Arya's like, you can't see in that eye. Having a milky white eye is not normal. As far as we know, Old Nan, outside of the fact that her irises are white, her eyes look regular. So, while having a light eye color is weird, there's no indication that she's actually visually impaired. You know what I mean? The same thing happens with Sansa, because Sansa... But Sansa's eyes are multiple times mentioned to be a very, very like pale shade of silver that looks like literal silver. And then she is also blind in this. So why does her eyes being silver indicate that she's blind? Especially when gray eyes are hereditary in her family. Like, she just has light eyes. It's very weird that this is a thing, especially when you have other characters whose eyes are fucking turquoise. That's not normal either. But like Cersei's not visually impaired and she doesn't have supervision or anything like that. So I don't know why that is a common thing throughout this. I don't mind Sansa having a striking eye color. Hell, Sophie Turner's eyes in Game of Thrones, her eyes are a very striking shade of blue that looks green sometimes. That's really cool. But it doesn't mean anything. It just means that Sansa has pretty eyes. Like, I don't understand why this correlation kept coming up and why I never stopped and thought like, oh, this is kind of weird. But anyway, like I said, that's a problem with multiple versions of Prophs, though. It's not a knock on this version specifically. So that is the end of Prophs 3.0. I need to get off of this because this recording is an hour long. So next episode, we will jump to the second part of Prophs 3.0 part 1. This is so confusing. And again, we will start over with the same like chapters that are in this one, Bran, Jon, Arya, that sort of thing. So I will see you for that. If you like this episode, like it on the YouTubes, subscribe to the channel so you can be updated when this next episode comes out, or whatever the next episode is when you're watching this. Also, it would be really helpful if you guys would go back and watch the backlog. You can catch up on this series, or you can watch other series, or watch some non-fanfic reread project related stuff. And like I said, I will see you for the next episode. Bye!